The document slid across the mahogany table toward me, and I watched my own signature, or something close enough to it, stare back at me from the bottom of a page I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I lifted the paper, the weight of it somehow heavier than mere words on fiber should be. The letterhead belonged to Patterson and Associates, my lawyer's firm, but the words declared me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. Hey there, beautiful souls. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my story today. I am curious, what part of the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city in the comments below. All right, let us dive into what happened to me. The conference room felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the walls pressing inward as my daughter sat across from me with her hands folded, her expression a careful mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. My son stood by the window, his back rigid, refusing to meet my gaze. I set the document down slowly, deliberately, watching it settle against the polished wood grain. This is what you think of me? The words came out steadier than I felt inside. My daughter leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table's surface. Mom, you're 61. You forgot to pay the water bill 3 months in a row. I was traveling. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the floor with a sound that made my son finally turn around. He moved toward me, his footsteps measured, controlled. You tried to wire $50,000 to someone claiming to be from the IRS. My jaw clenched. I had questioned that call, had hung up twice before finally calling my accountant. But somehow that detail had been omitted from their narrative. The truth twisted itself into something unrecognizable when filtered through their agenda. I watched them exchange a glance, a silent communication that excluded me entirely from a conversation about my own life. The door opened, and a man in a gray suit entered, his briefcase clicking open with practiced efficiency. He extracted more papers, spreading them across the table like evidence at a trial where I hadn't been allowed to present my defense. Bank statements, medical records I hadn't authorized anyone to access, a photograph of my kitchen counter cluttered with pill bottles, my vitamins and supplements arranged to look like evidence of confusion rather than a commitment to health. Mrs. Riley, I'm Theodore Brennan, court-appointed evaluator. He didn't offer his hand. I remained standing, my fingers gripping the back of my chair until my knuckles ached. The evaluator settled into a seat, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed documents I still hadn't been permitted to read fully. My daughter shifted in her chair, crossing her legs, that same false sympathy plastered across her face. She'd worn that expression at her father's funeral, too, right before suggesting we sell the house he'd built with his own hands. The evaluator's pen scratched across a notepad, each stroke feeling like another nail in the coffin of my autonomy. I studied the room, noting the security camera in the corner, the way my son had positioned himself between me and the door. They'd planned this carefully, orchestrated every detail. The realization hit like ice water through my veins. I moved toward the table despite my son's positioning, refusing to let them turn me into a ghost in my own life. My hand landed flat on the stack of documents, the slap of palm against paper, sharp enough to make Theodore Brennan's pen pause mid-stroke. The medical records bore letterheads from doctors I'd seen once, maybe twice, not the physician who'd treated me for 30 years and would have testified to my perfect health. These aren't complete. My voice came out steady, stronger than the trembling in my legs suggested. My daughter uncrossed her legs, leaning forward with that practiced concern that had fooled social workers and church ladies for years. She reached across the table, her manicured nails clicking against the wood as she retrieved a folder I hadn't noticed before. Mama, we're just trying to help. Her voice dripped with the same sweetness she'd used when convincing her father to co-sign her third failed business loan. I yanked my hand back from the table, documents scattering. One medical report slid across the polished surface and landed face up, revealing highlighted sections, words like forgetful and confused about dates, and difficulty managing finances. Lies wrapped in clinical language, probably fed to some overworked intern who'd spent 15 minutes with me while I recovered from the flu. Theodore Brennan gathered the papers with methodical precision, reorganizing them into their previous order. His movements broadcast disapproval, as if my resistance proved every fabrication in those files. He withdrew a tablet from his briefcase, tapping the screen until it glowed with what looked like bank transaction records. "Mrs. Riley, can you explain these withdrawals?" He turned the screen toward me without meeting my eyes. The numbers swam into focus, large sums pulled from my savings account over 6 months. Dates and amounts I'd never authorized. My chest tightened, breath-catching as I recognized the pattern. Every withdrawal corresponded with my daughter's visits, those afternoons when she'd insisted on helping me organize my paperwork while I made her lunch. I grabbed the edge of the table, steadying myself as the room seemed to tilt. My son rose from his position by the door, moving with false casualness to stand behind my daughter's chair. Their solidarity formed a wall, united against the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise them. "I didn't make those withdrawals." Each word felt like pushing stones uphill. My daughter's hand fluttered to her throat, her eyes widening with manufactured shock. She'd practiced that expression too, probably in the same mirror where she'd rehearsed her concerned daughter routine. Theodore Brennan's fingers flew across his tablet, documenting my denial with the enthusiasm of someone building a case rather than seeking truth. The lawyer, my supposed lawyer, finally spoke from his position against the wall, his arms crossed over his expensive suit. "Kimberly, your children have provided testimony that you've been making concerning statements about your finances being stolen." The chair legs scraped against the floor as I pushed back from the table, standing despite the tremor in my legs. My knees threatened to buckle, but I locked them straight, refusing to show weakness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Faces I'd kissed goodnight for years, now wearing masks of strangers. I moved toward the window, each step deliberate, my hand trailing along the wall for balance. The city sprawled below, 14 floors down, oblivious to the execution happening in this sterile conference room. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, a ghost superimposed over the distant buildings. Behind me, I could see them all watching, waiting for me to crack. The statements are concerning because they're true. My voice came out stronger than I expected. Theodore Brennan's pen stopped moving. The silence stretched tight as a wire. I turned from the window, gripping the back of an empty chair positioned against the wall. My knuckles went white against the dark leather. My daughter shifted in her seat, her designer purse sliding from her lap to the floor with a muffled thump. She left it there, too focused on exchanging glances with my son. The lawyer uncrossed his arms and pulled a folder from his briefcase. The papers inside rustled as he opened it, each sound amplified in the thick quiet. He slid the documents across the table toward where I'd been sitting, his movements practiced and smooth. I recognized the forms without needing to read them: medical evaluations, cognitive assessments, declarations of incompetency. I circled back to the table, standing rather than sitting, and flipped through the pages. Dr. Patricia Mosley's signature adorned the bottom of the psychiatric evaluation. I'd never met any Dr. Mosley. The date on the assessment was from 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday when I'd been volunteering at the community center, serving meals to families who actually needed help. My hands shook as I held the fabricated document. The paper crinkled under my tightening grip. I looked up at the lawyer, searching his face for some flicker of conscience, some indication he understood he was participating in theft. His expression remained neutral, professionally detached. A man simply doing his job. I never saw this doctor. Mother, you don't remember? My daughter's voice dripped with false patience. We took you there after you had that episode at the grocery store. The invented memory hung between us. I'd had no episode. I'd had no appointment. But they were rewriting my history, paragraph by paragraph, replacing reality with their convenient fiction. My son nodded along, supporting her lie with his silence and that slight tilt of his head that suggested sad agreement. I dropped the papers back onto the table. They scattered slightly, some sliding toward the lawyer, others toward Theodore Brennan, who reached out and straightened them with meticulous care. His tablet screen reflected in his glasses as he typed another note, probably documenting my confused reaction to evidence of my own medical treatment. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. I moved back toward the window, needing air, needing space. My chest constricted, each breath requiring conscious effort. They wanted me to break down, to prove their case through my own distress. I pressed my palm flat against the cool glass, using the temperature to anchor myself, to stay present. My daughter stood and crossed the room toward me. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate and measured. I watched her reflection approach in the window glass, her face composed into an expression of manufactured concern. She reached for my shoulder, her fingers light against my blazer. I jerked away from her touch. The movement was instinctive, visceral. My shoulder blade hit the window frame, and the impact sent a sharp pain down my spine. She froze, her hand suspended in the air between us, her mouth forming a small O of surprise that looked almost genuine. Don't! The word came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. Behind us, I heard the scrape of a chair. My son was standing now, too. I could see him in the peripheral edges of the window's reflection, his tall frame unfolding slowly. The lawyer remained seated, but his posture had shifted forward, alert, observing. Theodore Brennan's fingers had stilled on his tablet. My daughter's hand dropped to her side. She stepped back, but something in her eyes had changed. The mask of patience was slipping, revealing something harder beneath. She glanced toward her brother, and some unspoken communication passed between them. He moved around the conference table, positioning himself near the door. I felt the geometry of the room shift. They had triangulated me against the window, blocked my exit. The realization sent adrenaline flooding through my system. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I forced them to relax, forced my breathing to steady despite the hammering of my heart against my ribs. Perhaps we should take a break, the lawyer suggested. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to tense negotiations. No. My son spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. We need to finish this today. I pushed off from the window, moving laterally along the wall. My daughter shifted to mirror my movement, maintaining the distance between us. The dining room opened to my left, its doorway offering another route. I angled toward it, testing whether they would block me again. My son took 2 steps, cutting off that path. The tables sat between us now, covered with their evidence, their fabrications. I reached down and swept my hand across the nearest stack of documents. Papers flew, some catching air and spiraling, others sliding across the polished wood surface. Theodore Brennan grabbed for his tablet, protecting it from the cascade. Mother! My daughter's voice cracked with real emotion now, anger bleeding through the artificial sweetness. I kept moving, circling the table. My hip caught the corner of a chair, sending it scraping backward. The noise was harsh, violent in the hushed room. I grabbed the chair's back and shoved it hard toward my son. It rolled on its casters, forcing him to sidestep. In that moment of his distraction, I darted past him into the dining room. My hand caught the doorframe as I turned. The wood grain was smooth under my palm, real and solid. I heard footsteps behind me, quick and urgent. The dining room stretched before me, my grandmother's china cabinet standing sentinel against the far wall. The cabinet had been mine for 40 years, inherited and cherished. I wondered how quickly they would auction it once they had control. My daughter appeared in the doorway. Her face was flushed now, red creeping up her neck to model her carefully applied makeup. She'd loosened her composure, let the frustration show. Good. Let them reveal themselves. Let the lawyer see what this really was. You're making this harder than it needs to be. She advanced into the room, her voice tight. I backed toward the china cabinet, my shoulders touching the cool glass of its doors. The crystal inside rattled slightly from the impact. My reflection fractured in the beveled edges of the cabinet's mirror panels, multiplying me into a dozen distorted versions. I saw my son enter the room behind his sister. Saw the lawyer hovering in the doorway, his briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield. "Where's Victoria?" I asked suddenly. The question landed like a slap. My daughter stopped mid-step. My son's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. Victoria was my youngest, the one who'd stopped returning my calls 3 weeks ago. The one whose absence from this intervention screamed louder than any accusation. "She couldn't make it," my daughter said, but her eyes slid away from mine. I laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. It echoed off the dining room walls, bouncing back at us. I saw Theodore Brennan shift uncomfortably in the doorway, his tablet screen going dark as he lowered it. She wouldn't be part of this. I stated it as fact. My son moved closer, his hands raised in what he probably thought was a calming gesture. I tracked his approach, watching how he positioned himself between me and the doorway back to the living room. They were still trying to box me in, still treating me like something to be managed and controlled. The silver letter opener lay on the side table where I'd left it that morning, next to the stack of unopened mail. My fingers closed around its carved handle, the metal cool and substantial against my palm. I didn't raise it, didn't threaten anyone with it. I simply held it, letting the weight of it anchor me to this moment, to this room, to my right to stand in my own home with whatever I chose. My daughter's eyes locked onto the opener. Her face went pale, then flushed red. She took a step backward, her hip colliding with the corner of the dining table. The impact sent a tremor through the polished wood, rattling the crystal vase that had been my mother's. "Put that down." Her voice came out thin, stretched tight. I tested the balance of the letter opener, letting it rest across my open palm. The engraved handle caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. My grandfather had used this opener every day of his retirement, slicing through correspondence with the same deliberation he'd brought to every aspect of his life. I'd watched him at this very table, his hands steady and sure, never doubting his capacity to handle his own affairs. "You think I'm dangerous now?" I asked, but I didn't wait for an answer. Theodore Brennan pressed himself against the doorframe. The leather of his briefcase creaked as his grip tightened. I watched a bead of sweat trace down his temple, following the line of his jaw. He'd probably never had a competency meeting go sideways like this. His tablet remained dark against his chest. All those carefully prepared documents and assessments rendered useless by the simple fact that I wouldn't cooperate with my own erasure. My son moved laterally, sliding along the far side of the table. His dress shoes whispered against the hardwood floor. He was trying to circle around, to get behind me where he could grab my wrist if needed. I'd seen him use the same tactical approach during his years as a high school wrestling coach, patient, calculating, waiting for the right moment to execute a takedown. I shifted my stance, keeping him in my peripheral vision. The china cabinet pressed against my spine, solid and unyielding. Somewhere in the house, the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3. Each chime resonated through the floorboards, marking time in a house where time itself had become weaponized against me. "Mom, please." My daughter held out her hand, palm up, as if I were a child with a forbidden object. "You're proving their point." The words hit like a physical blow. I felt my chest constrict, breath catching somewhere between my lungs and throat. They had assessments, evaluations, probably testimony from neighbors about the time I'd forgotten to move my car on street cleaning day, or when I'd left the garden hose running overnight. Small human errors, now cataloged and weaponized, transformed into evidence of decline. I set the letter opener back on the table with deliberate care. The small click of metal on wood seemed obscenely loud. But I didn't step away from it. Instead, I pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat, my hand resting inches from the opener's handle. The chair creaked under my weight, the same chair I'd sat in for 30 years of family dinners, homework supervision, and holiday gatherings. My son stopped his circling. He stood frozen mid-step, one hand still extended toward where I'd been standing. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by wariness. Good. Let him be uncertain. Let them all recalibrate whatever script they'd prepared for this moment. Theodore Brennan cleared his throat. The sound was wet, nervous. He took a half step into the room, then thought better of it. His free hand went to his collar, tugging at the already loosened tie. The papers in his briefcase rustled as he shifted his weight. "Mrs. Riley, perhaps we could all sit down and discuss this calmly." His voice carried the professional smoothness of someone trained to de-escalate, but underneath it ran a current of genuine unease. I looked at each of them in turn. My daughter, her designer purse still clutched under one arm like armor. My son, his expensive watch catching the light as he lowered his reaching hand. The lawyer, with his careful distance and his documents full of medical opinions from doctors I'd seen twice, maybe 3 times. The mail on the side table caught my eye. Bills, mostly. A few advertisements. One cream-colored envelope with an attorney's office in the return address, not Theodore Brennan's firm. I'd opened that one yesterday, read it 3 times to make sure I understood. My sister had recommended the lawyer, given me the number during our last phone call, the one where I'd finally admitted what was happening. "You want to talk?" I leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms. "Then explain why Victoria isn't here. The truth this time." My daughter's jaw tightened. She exchanged a glance with her brother, some silent sibling communication that excluded me completely. He gave a small shake of his head, barely perceptible, but I caught it. I'd spent decades reading their minute expressions, knowing when they'd broken curfew or failed a test before they opened their mouths. "She doesn't agree with this," my son finally said. "She thinks we're moving too fast." The admission fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples of tension spread outward, visible in the way my daughter's shoulders hunched, in how Theodore Brennan's fingers drummed against his briefcase. So there was dissent in their ranks. Victoria, my youngest, had refused to participate in this coordinated ambush. I stood and walked to the window, putting distance between myself and the 3 people who'd invaded my living room. My reflection stared back from the glass, superimposed over the street outside. The woman looking back had gray threading through her hair, lines etched deep around her eyes, but her jaw was set firm. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of Theodore Brennan's briefcase opening. "Mrs. Riley, please sit down so we can—" "I'll stand." The traffic light on the corner cycled through its colors: red, yellow, green. A woman pushed a stroller across the intersection, pausing to adjust the baby's blanket. Normal life, continuing while mine fractured. My hands gripped the windowsill, fingers pressing hard against painted wood. Footsteps approached from behind. My daughter's perfume reached me first, that expensive French brand she'd started wearing after her promotion. The scent used to make me proud. Now, it smelled like betrayal, wrapped in lavender and bergamot. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I turned. She stood 3 feet away, arms crossed over her silk blouse. Her nails were perfectly manicured, glossy burgundy that matched her lipstick. Behind her, my son had moved to stand beside Theodore Brennan, presenting a united front. The lawyer had spread documents across my coffee table, transforming the surface where I did crossword puzzles into an administrative battlefield. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen. A text from Victoria. "Mom, don't sign anything. I'm coming over. 10 minutes. The phone nearly slipped from my suddenly trembling hands. I caught it, clutched it against my chest. My daughter lunged forward, reaching for it, but I stepped back. My hip connected with the windowsill, sending a sharp spike of pain up my side. "What did she say?" "That's my business." My son crossed the room in 4 long strides. He'd always been tall, taken after his father in that way, and now he used that height like a weapon, standing over me, blocking the light from the window, casting me in his shadow. "We're trying to help you. Why can't you see that?" His hand extended toward my phone. I pivoted, moving around him with surprising agility. The physical therapy I'd done after my knee surgery last year had kept me flexible. I reached the hallway, putting the couch between us. Theodore Brennan gathered his documents, clutching them to his chest as if I might lunge across the furniture and rip them apart. The doorbell rang. Everyone froze. My daughter's eyes widened. My son's face flushed red, color creeping up from his collar. The lawyer's carefully neutral expression cracked, revealing something like panic underneath. "Expecting someone else?" I moved toward the door. My son blocked my path, positioning himself between me and the entrance. His breathing had quickened, chest rising and falling beneath his button-down shirt. The doorbell rang again, followed by sharp knocking. A voice called through the door, male, unfamiliar, professional. "Mrs. Riley, I'm Dennis Faulkner from Caldwell & Associates. We spoke on the phone yesterday." Theodore Brennan's briefcase snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot. He stood abruptly, straightening his tie with jerky movements. My daughter grabbed his arm, fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. Her knuckles had gone white. "You hired another lawyer," my son said. Not a question, an accusation. I pushed past him. My shoulder connected with his chest, and he stumbled backward, caught off guard. The hallway stretched before me, 15 feet that felt like miles. My hand closed around the doorknob, turned it. Cool air rushed in from outside, carrying the smell of rain-damp concrete and car exhaust. Dennis Faulkner stood on my porch, a lean man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Behind him, Victoria climbed out of her car at the curb, moving fast despite her heels clicking on the pavement. "Mrs. Riley?" Dennis extended his hand. "I apologize for the short notice, but your sister called this morning and explained the urgency." His grip was firm, warm, real. I held on perhaps a moment too long, steadying myself against the doorframe with my other hand. Victoria reached the porch steps, her face flushed from hurrying. She'd always been the sensitive one, the daughter who called every week, who remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders. "I'm sorry I'm late." Victoria's words came out breathless. "Traffic was—" She stopped, looking past me into the house. Her expression shifted from apologetic to furious in an instant. "You started without me?" My other daughter appeared in the hallway behind me. The sisters faced each other across the threshold, mirror images with different souls. Same bone structure, same height, completely opposite intentions. "We didn't think you were coming." "Because you told me it was scheduled for next week." Victoria's voice could have cut glass. "You lied to me." Dennis Faulkner cleared his throat. He pulled a document from his portfolio, holding it so I could see the letterhead. Official, legal, bearing seals and stamps. My sister had been busy after our phone call. Very busy. "I've filed an emergency motion to stay any proceedings," he said. "Judge Martinez has agreed to a hearing tomorrow morning at 9. Behind me, Theodore Brennan's footsteps approached. I could hear the wheels of his briefcase scraping against my hardwood floor, probably leaving scratches. The sound made my teeth clench. This was my home, my space. They'd invaded it like an occupying force, and now they were retreating, leaving damage in their wake. "This is highly irregular." Theodore Brennan's voice had gone thin, reedy. "We have medical documentation, psychiatric evaluations, from doctors who saw my client twice." Dennis stepped into the doorway, forcing everyone back. "Doctors you selected and paid for. That's going to look very interesting to Judge Martinez. Write unique plot with 80% action description, 20% dialogue. The house emptied like a wound draining." Theodore Brennan gathered his papers with jerky, frustrated movements, shoving documents into his briefcase so hard the leather sides bulged. I watched his hands shake as he snapped the locks closed. The metallic clicks echoed through my living room, punctuating his defeat. My daughter, the one who'd lied to Victoria, stood frozen near the fireplace. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her fingers twisted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, spinning it around and around until the skin underneath turned red. I'd given her that bracelet for her 40th birthday. The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. "We'll see you in court, Mrs. Riley." Theodore Brennan moved toward the door, his shoulder brushing mine hard enough to make me stumble. Dennis caught my elbow, steadying me. The lawyer's deliberate contact wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Violence wrapped in plausible deniability. The front door slammed. The sound reverberated through the walls, rattling the picture frames in the hallway. I watched through the window as Theodore Brennan's Mercedes pulled away from the curb, its brake lights flashing angry red before disappearing around the corner. My daughter followed in her Lexus 30 seconds later, her face a pale blur behind tinted glass. Victoria paced the length of my living room, her heels punching divots into the carpet with each aggressive step. She'd removed her coat, revealing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Everything about her screamed success, power, the kind of competence that couldn't be questioned. Dennis Faulkner stood near the bookshelf, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to someone about filing deadlines and witness lists. I sank onto the couch. My legs had turned to water somewhere between the doorway confrontation and now. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the past hour evaporated, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion that settled into my bones. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pressed them between my knees, trying to still the involuntary movement, but it traveled up my arms instead. Victoria stopped pacing. She crouched in front of me, her hands covering mine. Her grip was firm, warm, grounding. For the first time in months, someone touched me like I was real, substantial, capable of understanding the gesture. Not like the careful, condescending pats the doctors had given me, testing my reactions, documenting my responses for their reports. "I need coffee," I said. My voice came out hoarse, scraped raw from disuse. I'd barely spoken during the entire confrontation, letting the lawyers battle while I stood silent as evidence, a thing to be evaluated rather than consulted. The kitchen offered temporary refuge. I filled the coffee maker with precise movements, measuring grounds, pouring water, hitting the start button. The familiar ritual steadied my hands. The machine gurgled and hissed, filling the silence with normal sounds. Through the doorway, I could see Dennis still on his phone, pacing now in the same pattern Victoria had traced minutes earlier. She'd moved to the window, staring out at the street as if expecting Theodore Brennan to return with reinforcements. The coffee finished brewing. I poured 3 cups, added cream to mine, left the others black. Carrying them required focus. The liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim with each step. I set them on the coffee table without spilling a drop. A small victory, but I catalogued it anyway. Evidence of competence, proof of steady hands and clear intentions. Dennis ended his call. He picked up a cup, took a long sip, then pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in cramped handwriting. His pen moved across the page as he spoke, capturing every word he said in duplicate. "Judge Martinez will want testimony from your primary care physician, the one who's been treating you for 20 years, not these specialists your family hired." He paused, pen hovering. "Are you still seeing Dr. Patterson?" "Every 3 months." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, absorbing its heat. "Last appointment was 6 weeks ago. Clean bill of health, except for the arthritis." Dennis made a note. Victoria returned from the window, settling onto the arm of the couch beside me. Her presence formed a protective barrier between me and the door, a human shield against future intrusions. "They'll argue that you gave power of attorney to your sister during a moment of weakness." Dennis flipped to a new page. "We need to establish that you were pressured, that you didn't understand the full implications of what you were signing." The memory surfaced like bile. My sister's voice on the phone, urgent, explaining how this was just a precaution, just temporary, just in case something happened. I'd signed the papers at her kitchen table, surrounded by her grandchildren's artwork and the smell of pot roast. Everything carefully staged to feel safe, familial, innocent. The trap had been baited with normalcy. "She told me it was for emergency medical decisions only," I said. "That's what the notary witnessed me saying. That's in the transcript." Victoria's hand landed on my shoulder, squeezed once, released. Through the window, the afternoon light had shifted to that harsh slant that preceded sunset. Shadows stretched across my lawn, turning familiar shapes strange and threatening. A car passed slowly on the street. My spine stiffened until I recognized the neighbor 2 doors down, returning from work at the hospital. Normal life continuing while mine had been dissected and examined like a laboratory specimen. Dennis gathered his papers into neat stacks. He produced a folder from his briefcase, handed it across the coffee table. Inside, documents bore official seals, court stamps, the architecture of legal protection being constructed around me 1 page at a time. "Don't sign anything else," he said. "Don't talk to your sister or anyone from her legal team. If they contact you, document everything: time, date, exact words. We're building a case for undue influence and elder exploitation. The words hit like physical blows. Elder exploitation. As if I'd become some pitiful creature, too feeble to recognize predators wearing familiar faces. Storyblock 8 Tom. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they should have been, each one jarring my knees as I climbed toward the building's granite facade. Dennis moved beside me, his briefcase swinging with each stride, while Victoria flanked my other side. They'd positioned themselves like bookends, and I hated needing them there even as I appreciated the solidarity. Behind us, traffic hummed along the downtown streets, people going about ordinary Tuesdays while I walked toward a hearing that would determine whether I still possessed the legal right to control my own existence. The metal detector beeped. I removed my watch, my belt, the small pocket knife I'd carried for 30 years. Each item dropped into the gray plastic bin felt like another piece of competence being stripped away. The security guard waved me through with barely a glance, already focused on the next person in line. 3rd floor. The elevator lurched upward, and my stomach dropped in opposition. Victoria's perfume, something floral and aggressive, filled the small space. Dennis checked his phone, typed something rapidly, his thumbs moving with the ease of someone half his age. The numbers above the door climbed. 2, 3, ding. Courtroom 3B. The nameplate gleamed brass against dark wood. Dennis pushed through the door first, holding it open while Victoria and I entered. The space stretched longer than it had seemed from the hallway. Rows of benches, a judge's elevated platform at the far end. The seal of Georgia mounted above it like a warning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular frequency that always made my temples ache during long meetings at the insurance company where I'd worked for 27 years before retirement. They were already there. My sister Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table. Her lawyer, a woman with severe glasses and an expensive suit, arranging papers with mechanical precision. Margaret wore navy blue, pearls, her hair styled in that careful way that cost money but looked effortless. She glanced up as we entered, and her face performed sadness, concern, the expression of someone burdened by difficult duty. I'd seen that same look when she'd convinced our mother to sell the family house, when she'd persuaded our brother to invest in her husband's failing business, when she'd talked our cousin out of the job offer in Seattle. The performance was flawless. I wanted to rip it off her face. Dennis guided me to the defense table, pulled out the chair. The wood was hard beneath me, unforgiving. Victoria sat directly behind us in the gallery, close enough that I could hear her breathing, steady and controlled. My own breath came shorter, shallower. I pressed my palms flat against the table's surface, feeling the cool grain of whatever cheap veneer they'd used. Margaret's lawyer stood, buttoned her jacket, approached the judge's bench. The bailiff announced something, names, case numbers, legal terminology that washed over me like radio static. Judge Henderson emerged from his chambers, robes flowing, and everyone rose. My knees protested. We sat again on command, choreographed compliance. "We're here regarding the petition for guardianship filed by Margaret Chen," the judge said, reading from papers before him. Mrs. Chen alleges that her sister, the respondent, lacks capacity to manage her financial and medical affairs. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lacks capacity. As if 61 years of living, working, paying taxes, raising 2 children, managing a household through divorce and cancer scares and economic recessions had somehow evaporated, leaving behind an empty vessel too incompetent to sign her own checks. Margaret's lawyer launched into her opening statement. She painted a picture of decline, forgotten appointments, suspicious financial decisions, isolation from family, the hallmarks of diminishing mental acuity. Each fabrication had been built on a grain of truth, then distorted beyond recognition. Yes, I'd missed Margaret's birthday lunch last year because I'd been in the emergency room with Victoria, who'd had a gallbladder attack. Yes, I'd withdrawn $15,000 from savings to replace the HVAC system that had died during the July heatwave. Yes, I'd stopped attending family gatherings. Because Margaret had started ambushing me with concerned questions, probing inquiries disguised as sisterly care. Dennis rose when she finished. His movements were economical, practiced. He didn't approach the bench but stood at our table, one hand resting on the surface as if drawing strength from the solid wood. Your Honor, this petition is built on deception and financial motivation. My client is a retired insurance underwriter with 40 years of professional experience evaluating risk and making sound decisions. She has no cognitive impairment, no medical diagnosis suggesting incompetence, and no history of irresponsible behavior. What she does have is a sister who convinced her to sign a power of attorney under false pretenses, then used that document to freeze her bank accounts and credit cards before filing this petition. Margaret's face tightened. The mask slipped for just a second, revealing something harder underneath. The judge looked at me directly. His eyes were gray, analytical, revealing nothing of whatever calculations were occurring behind them. Mrs. Riley, do you understand why you're here today? My voice emerged stronger than I'd expected. Yes, sir. My sister wants to take control of my life and my money. And you dispute her claims about your mental capacity? I dispute everything she's claimed. Every word of it is either a lie or a distortion. He made a note. We'll hear testimony then. Mrs. Chen, you may call your first witness. Margaret took the stand. She swore on the Bible with one hand raised, her rings catching the overhead lights. Her lawyer began the examination, and Margaret delivered her prepared script with the conviction of someone who'd rehearsed until the lies sounded like truth. She described me as confused, forgetful, making impulsive purchases, refusing medical care, becoming paranoid about family members. She produced bank statements showing cash withdrawals, receipts for items she claimed I couldn't remember buying, a letter from my primary care physician expressing concern about missed appointments. Each piece of evidence had been curated, contextualized, weaponized. The cash withdrawals were for Victoria's daughter's college graduation gift and the new washing machine I'd bought when mine flooded the laundry room. The receipts were for normal household purchases. The doctor's letter had been written after Margaret called his office, claiming I was exhibiting dementia symptoms, prompting him to suggest evaluation. Suggestion Margaret had transformed into medical concern. Dennis cross-examined. He dismantled her testimony piece by piece, exposing contradictions, forcing her to admit she hadn't actually witnessed most of what she'd described, revealing that the power of attorney had been obtained under pretenses Margaret herself admitted were misleading. Her composure cracked incrementally, tiny fissures spreading across the careful facade. Then the medical expert testified. Dr. Patricia Hammond, Margaret's hired psychiatrist who'd never actually examined me, who'd formed her opinions based solely on Margaret's descriptions and cherry-picked documentation. She spoke in clinical terms about age-related cognitive decline, vulnerability to exploitation, the need for protective intervention. Every word was reasonable, measured, devastating. Dennis called our own expert, Dr. James Okonkwo, the neuropsychologist who'd spent 3 hours evaluating me the week before, administering tests, asking questions, measuring cognitive function against established baselines. He testified that I'd scored in the superior range for my age group, demonstrated excellent memory and executive function, showed no signs of dementia or impairment. Back and forth. Action and reaction. Truth and fabrication colliding in the sterile arena of courtroom procedure. During the lunch recess, I sat in the hallway outside while Dennis and Victoria huddled nearby, discussing strategy. Margaret and her lawyer disappeared into a conference room. My hand shook when I tried to open the sandwich Victoria had brought, and I gave up, leaving it wrapped on the bench beside me. Down the corridor, a janitor pushed a cart, cleaning supplies clattering with each bump in the worn linoleum. When court resumed, Dennis called me to testify. The witness stand felt exposed, elevated, like standing on a stage with spotlights trained on every weakness. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, sat. The microphone hummed slightly, amplifying my breathing. Dennis asked questions. I answered them clearly, methodically, recounting the power of attorney signing, Margaret's subsequent actions, my discovery of the frozen accounts, the cascade of events that had brought us here. Margaret's lawyer objected repeatedly, sustained, and overruled in equal measure. Then came cross-examination. Margaret's lawyer approached with predatory patience. "Mrs. Riley, isn't it true you live alone?" "Yes." "And you're 61 years old?" "Yes." "Have you ever forgotten to pay a bill on time?" "Once, the cable company. They changed their billing date." "Have you ever gotten lost while driving?" "Construction detoured me through an unfamiliar area last month." Each answer was twisted, reframed, added to an inventory of supposed incompetence. The lawyer produced photographs. My house exterior, showing peeling paint on the trim, overgrown landscaping in one corner. Evidence of decline, she called it. I called it deferred maintenance during a pandemic when contractors were booked months out. The testimony stretched into late afternoon. Judge Henderson called for closing arguments. Dennis spoke about autonomy, about the dangerous precedent of allowing families to seize control based on fabricated concerns. Margaret's lawyer countered with protection, with duty, with the tragedy that would result from leaving a vulnerable woman unprotected. The judge dismissed us. No immediate ruling. He'd review the evidence, issue his decision within 10 days. We filed out past Margaret and her lawyer. Our bodies didn't touch, but the space between us crackled with everything unsaid. In the elevator, descending, Victoria's hand found mine and squeezed. Dennis stared at the closing doors, his jaw tight. "Now we wait," he said. Outside, the sun had emerged from behind clouds, and the sudden brightness made me squint. Somewhere nearby, a car horn blared. People walked past on the sidewalk, absorbed in their phones, their conversations, their normal lives. I stood on the courthouse steps and felt the full weight of what had just occurred, what might still happen, settling across my shoulders like a physical burden. 10 days to learn whether I would remain myself or become someone's legal ward, my decisions subject to approval, my freedom contingent on another person's permission. 10 days to discover if family loyalty meant anything when measured against greed. I walked toward Dennis's car, each step forward feeling like forward motion. Like choosing to keep moving even when the ground had turned, I spent those 10 days reclaiming every piece of myself they'd tried to erase. The morning after the hearing, I drove to the community center, where I'd volunteered for 15 years before Margaret started her campaign. My hands gripped the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2, demonstrating the control they'd questioned in court. The parking lot was half empty. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, watching people move through the glass doors. Elderly men with canes, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Inside, the director's face split into a wide smile. She came around her desk and pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender hand cream and coffee. No words needed. She'd known something was wrong when I'd stopped showing up 6 months ago, when Margaret had convinced me that maybe I was too confused to be responsible for organizing the food bank inventory. "I need my Tuesday shift back," I said. "It's yours." The food bank occupied the center's basement. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights humming overhead, metal shelves stacked with canned goods, and boxes of pasta. I pulled on the volunteer apron and got to work sorting the morning's donations. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. Vegetables here, proteins there, grains on the third shelf. The rhythm settled something inside me that had been jangling loose for months. A young mother came through the line, a baby on her hip, and a toddler clutching her leg. I filled her bag with careful selection, adding extras where I could. She met my eyes and nodded once. That connection, that moment of shared humanity, reminded me why I'd fought so hard in that courtroom. The next day, I drove to the bank. The manager recognized me immediately. I'd been banking there for 30 years. I presented my identification, requested copies of every account statement for the past 5 years, and had them update my contact information. Margaret had somehow gotten herself added as an account alert recipient. I had that removed. The manager printed the confirmation, and I folded it carefully into my purse. Then I visited my doctor, the one who'd actually examined me, not the hired expert Margaret had paid for his opinion. Dr. Patel's office smelled like antiseptic and vanilla air freshener. He conducted another cognitive assessment, taking his time with each question, each memory test, each physical coordination check. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You're healthy, Kimberly. Sharp as anyone your age. Sharper than most. I'll put that in writing. I need you to." He printed the evaluation on official letterhead. I added it to the folder Dennis had prepared, the one that already bulged with evidence of my competence. Insurance alone wouldn't win this. I needed to show I was actively engaged, actively present, actively fighting. Victoria called every evening. I could hear her boys in the background during our conversations, their laughter and arguments creating a soundtrack of normal family chaos. She'd taken time off work to be at the hearing, and her restaurant was struggling in her absence. The guilt sat heavy in my stomach, but she wouldn't hear my apologies. "You're my mother," she said simply. "Where else would I be?" On day 7, I met with Dennis at his office. He'd received word that the judge was reviewing the medical testimony, comparing the dueling expert opinions. Margaret's lawyer had submitted additional documentation: character witnesses who'd observed my supposed confusion, neighbors who'd noticed mail piling up on my porch, a cashier who claimed I'd seemed disoriented at the grocery store. Dennis spread the papers across his conference table. I stood beside him, reading each statement, recognizing the distortions and half-truths that Margaret had assembled. The mail had piled up because I'd been visiting Victoria for a week. The grocery store confusion had been a single moment when I'd forgotten where they'd moved the coffee aisle during a remodel. Small, human moments twisted into evidence of decline. "She's thorough," Dennis said, his voice tight. "She's desperate." I pulled out my own folder, the one I'd been building. Volunteer schedules showing consistent attendance. Bank statements proving careful financial management. Letters from friends attesting to my character, my clarity, my independence. Dr. Patel's evaluation, crisp and clinical and definitive. Photographs from Victoria's boys' birthday party 2 weeks ago. Me laughing with my grandsons, teaching them to frost cupcakes, fully present in every moment. Dennis reviewed each item, his expression shifting from concern to something like hope. "This is good," he said. "This is very good." On day 9, Margaret called. I stared at her name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering. Her voice came through thin and strained, none of the confidence she'd displayed in the courtroom. "We should talk." We talked in court. Silence stretched between us, filled with everything we couldn't take back. Then she hung up. I set the phone down and watched the sun set through my kitchen window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring the judge's decision. Tomorrow, I'd learn whether truth mattered more than manipulation, whether evidence could overcome family betrayal. I made dinner: baked chicken, roasted vegetables, brown rice. I set the table properly, used cloth napkins, poured myself a glass of water in a crystal goblet. Small acts of dignity, of self-respect, of proving to myself that I was exactly who I'd always been. The food tasted good. I chewed slowly, savoring each bite. After dinner, I washed dishes by hand, feeling the warm water cascade over my fingers, watching soap bubbles catch the overhead light. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening. A dog barked. Children's voices called out in some game. Life continued its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to the extraordinary stakes of tomorrow's decision. Block 1010. 6 months later, I stood in the hardware store on 3rd Avenue, comparing paint samples under fluorescent lights. Ocean mist, sea glass, tranquil blue. The names meant nothing. I held each card up to the light, studying how the colors shifted from cool to warm depending on the angle. My fingers moved confidently through the selection. No tremor, no hesitation. The judge had ruled in my favor 3 days after that final hearing. Dennis had walked me through the restoration of every account, every authority, every piece of my autonomy that my daughter had tried to strip away. I selected sea glass and carried it to the counter. The clerk rang up the purchase along with brushes, rollers, drop cloths. I paid with my own credit card, the one in my name alone. The plastic felt substantial between my fingers as I tucked it back into my wallet. The spare bedroom needed freshening. I'd been living in this apartment for 4 months now, having sold the house where too many memories clung to the walls like cobwebs. The new place sat above a bakery. Every morning, the scent of rising bread drifted through my windows before my alarm even sounded. I'd wake to that smell and stretch, my body moving without pain through its morning routine. Back home, I spread newspapers across the bedroom floor and popped open the paint can. The chemical smell filled the room as I stirred, watching the color swirl into consistency. I'd done this before, years ago, when Robert and I had renovated our first apartment. My muscles remembered the motion, the rhythm of loading the roller and applying even pressure against the wall. The first stroke of color transformed the dingy cream into something fresh. I worked methodically, covering each section before moving to the next. Paint flecked onto my old t-shirt, dotted my forearms. Sweat gathered at my hairline. My shoulders ached pleasantly after the first hour, and I paused to drink water from the bottle I'd set on the windowsill. Through the window, the street bustled with afternoon activity. A vendor sold flowers from a cart. 2 teenagers argued over a basketball. A woman pushed a stroller while talking on her phone. I watched them for a moment, then returned to painting. The wall grew brighter with each pass of the roller. My phone buzzed on the dresser. I wiped my hands on a rag before checking it. Dennis had sent photos of the court documents. The final paperwork officially dissolving the conservatorship and awarding me damages for legal fees. I scrolled through the images, then set the phone aside. The legal battle felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. By evening, 3 walls gleamed with fresh paint. I cleaned the brushes in the bathroom sink, watching blue-tinted water swirl down the drain. My reflection in the mirror showed paint in my hair, a smudge on my cheek. I looked tired but content. I looked like someone who'd survived something difficult and come through stronger. The next morning, I took the bus to the community center on Riverside. I'd seen a flyer last week, volunteers needed for the literacy program. The coordinator, a compact man with silver glasses, reviewed my application in a cramped office lined with file cabinets. You have teaching experience? 30 years, high school English. He nodded, making notes on the paper. His pen scratched across the form, filling in boxes, checking requirements. Then he looked up, extending his hand across the desk. When can you start? I started the following Tuesday. They paired me with a woman named Sophia, who worked double shifts at a laundry service and wanted to read chapter books to her grandchildren. We sat at a table near the window, sunlight warming the pages as we worked through simple sentences. Her finger traced each word carefully, sounding out syllables. When she completed her first full paragraph without help, her face lit up with such pure joy that my chest tightened. Again, she said, and we read it together. I met with Sophia twice a week. On other days, I walked to the park and sat on a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across the water. Sometimes I brought a book. Sometimes I just sat, letting thoughts drift through my mind without forcing them into any particular shape. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and flowers. Joggers passed on the path. Dogs strained against leashes, eager to investigate every interesting smell. Margaret sent letters. I recognized her handwriting on the envelopes and stacked them, unopened, in a drawer. Perhaps someday I'd read them. Perhaps not. The choice belonged to me alone, and that felt like victory enough. My grandsons came to visit one Saturday. They burst through the door with their father, arms full of grocery bags. We made lunch together, sandwiches and fruit salad and homemade lemonade. They told me about school, about their soccer games, about the new puppy next door. I listened and asked questions and felt the warmth of their presence fill my small kitchen. After they left, I stood at my window watching the street below grow quiet as evening descended. The bakery closed, its owner locking the door and pulling down the metal grate. Lights flickered on in apartments across the street. Somewhere nearby, music played, something with drums and guitars that made me tap my foot against the floor. I turned back to my apartment, to my life, to everything I'd fought to keep. The walls gleamed their fresh color. Plants lined the windowsill, their leaves reaching toward the fading light. Books stacked on the coffee table waited to be read. Everything here belonged to me, answered to me, existed because I chose it. Tomorrow, I'd wake to the smell of bread. I'd make coffee and watch the sunrise paint the sky in gradients of pink and gold. I'd decide how to spend my hours, who to see, what to do. Every choice mine, every day earned. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.